there. I just was kind of going through my books and taking a look at things before this new semester starts. And I picked up this book. It's called Hegel and the Infinite. Of course, edited by Zizek. And I was just kind of skimming through it, and I found this really good essay by John Caputo that sort of looks at the possibility of radical theology, and specifically how it is made possible through Hegel. So this book really looks at sort of Hegelian, Hegelian thought, and sort of this overall turn to religion. So it's really interesting. And I will link it as well for you to take a look at too. But I just wanted to read this essay by Caputo because I just think it's really beautiful. And it says a lot of things that I wish I could say so eloquently. So his essay is called The Perversity of the Absolute, the Perverse Core of Hegel, and the Possibility of Radical Theology. So this is kind of a longer essay, so I'm probably going to split it into 2 videos. So just bear with me. It's very beautiful. And I'll go ahead and start reading now. Orthodox Christianity offers a formula for triumph over death, but the purchase price is high. The theory of 2 worlds, one here below, the other up above, the one up front, the other behind the scenes, the one in time, the other in eternity. By radical theology, I mean, among other things, a theology that has been bold enough to pull up this venerable root and to treat it as so much alienation or self-estrangement, to take it as a kind of modified Gnosticism. The 2 worlds theory is the basis of supernaturalism and superstition, of magic and thaumaturgy, in which we are called upon to enter into mysterious commerce with an otherworldly being in order to stay in his good graces. Radical theology has other advice to offer, like saying that death is part of the rhythm of things, albeit a divine rhythm. That uprooting of theology and subsequent transplanting onto more worldly soil got its most prestigious and powerful boost from Hegel, whose speculative tour de force left nothing afterward unchanged. But inasmuch as Hegel started something, radical theology, he did not quite finish. My tribute to Hegel will be perverse. I will treat him as a hero of perversity, by which I mean his success in introducing a felicitous and productive perversion, or, if you prefer, a paradigm shift, into the very nature of the absolute, if there is one that left Kierkegaard crying out for relief. In so doing, he opened the door for a radical theology and, as I hope to sketch here, for a new vision in political theology. I thus propose, in this very contrarian and perversitile spirit, to seek out the perverse core of Hegel, and indeed of the absolute itself, to borrow the phrase from Slavoj Zizek, used of Christianity. This will mean following Hegel where he did not mean to lead, marching to a drum he did not quite beat, taking up a cause he did not quite advocate, and so to pursue Hegelian perversity to its felicitous end. I propose, as Heidegger would have said, that we repeat Hegel. Repeat not what Hegel actually said, which has already been said by Hegel, but repeat the possible in Hegel, the possibilities Hegel opened up for us, repeating what is unfinished and still becoming in what Hegel said about becoming, repeating him, to be sure, in what is hopefully a perversely productive way, in the likeness of his own prodigious perversity. I treat Hegel as a springboard to radical theology precisely because he proposes a way to continue to think theologically, even after laying to rest the metaphysics and metaphorics of the 2 worlds, which then as today might have been mistaken for the very essence of theology, but is in fact an elemental figure of a pre-Copernican imagination and of mythological thinking. Like Hegel and Heidegger, like Nietzsche and like Levinas, I have lost my patience with the world behind the scenes of mythology and classical metaphysics. Hegel thinks theologically by taking the world as a horizon and by thinking God in the world, thereby radicalizing the Christian doctrine of incarnation. But let me say at the start that the relationship of God to the world defended by Hegel himself, that of being in itself externalizing or expressing itself in being for itself, and returning home in spirit as being in and for itself, is for me a no less extravagant flower in the garden of metaphysics. It will be replaced in these remarks by the relationship of the event to the world, which is a more descriptive way to look at things. Very simply put, the event is not what happens, but what is going on in what happens, while the world is everything that happens. The event is what is astir in the world, the root, as in radical, of the restlessness and impatience of the world with what happens, with its present configurations. A radical theology is a theology of the root, of the event. In this view, the world, what is being called in this volume the secular order, arises as a provisional and imperfect solution, a kind of makeshift to a problem posed to it by the name of God, or rather by the event that is stirring in the name of God, as temporary configuration patched together under the impact of a kind of divine eventiveness. This world I hope to show is everywhere marked by patches of the sacred and the holy, which are streaks and traces of divine events. That is why it makes no more sense to oppose the secular to the sacred, or to the holy, than to oppose a question to its answer, or a problem to its solution. My aim is thus to embrace this figure of perversity as a way to reconfigure the relationship of the secular order to the sacred and the holy, and to suggest a new constellation, to introduce another figure or framework, a more chiasmic one, in which the two intertwine, interact, interbreed so closely that it is misleading to speak of two. In this new configuration, certain restless forces, certain impatient powers and potentialities seek expression, and this expression is called the world, or the secular order. The world trembles with possibilities, is rocked by immemorial memories, grieves and rejoices in forces still unformed, giving form and expression to such forces only to become in turn undone and to stand in need of further reform, of still new forms, of realizing still more hidden potentialities which give it life in the first place. Such possibilities are the stuff politics and ethics are made of, they being arts of the possible, or more precisely, of the possibility of the impossible. On this view, the world is made to tremble by certain divine forces or intensities, certain events harbored in the name of God, which beat like the heart of a heartless world. Thus, it would make no sense to speak of keeping such forces out of politics, for that would be to keep our dreams of peace and justice out of politics. Although it will be of the utmost importance to rethink and reconceive the divine and the theological, not to mention the political. I treat these events or forces as a new post-Hegelian version or perversion of the absolute, whose perversity is such that the absolute is not exactly absolute but pure, where what is pure is not exactly being but becoming, where what is becoming pure and simple is the world, and the world is not simply what happens, but what is inwardly disturbed by the event that is going on in what happens. On this post-Hegelian accounting, theology belongs to the world as an ingredient in and constitutive of our cultural imagination, which means of the world's imagination. Theology dreams the dreams of the gods, dreams hitherto undreamt, hope against hope for what is coming, even as it remembers the dead who shall not have died in vain. Such dreams are the stuff of the Hegelian triumvirate of religion, art, and philosophy, the core of the life of the absolute spirit. But on my telling, a theological imagination is as much a part of culture as is artistic or conceptual imagination, with which it is inextricably related. So I propose to pervert this Hegelian schema by reproducing it without the hegemony and the hierarchy exercised by the metaphysical concept, or absolute knowledge. I take religion, art, and philosophy as three forms of a pluriform imaginative life, not so much a Vorstellung as a Darstellung, a presentation or exhibition of inner forces, giving multiple forms and shapes to a restlessness within the world, within ourselves, and within the things themselves. If there is any concept at all, it is that of the event, where the concept does not grasp anything but points, like a finger pointing to the moon, making for a concept of an inconceivable excess of things that it indicates but does not conceive. I number theology among the several discourses, and there are more than 3, that suspect an inner restlessness in things and feel called upon to give it voice. The Perverse Core of Christianity. In borrowing the trope of perversity from the subtitle of Zizek's The Puppet and the Dwarf, just sideline here, this book is very good, please read it. I want to draw attention to the provocative ambiguity by which it is beset. Does Zizek mean that the perverse core of Christianity lies in the way that Christianity, while supposed to give us the freedom of the children of God, the new being, the life of grace which liberates us from the law, is actually perversely reinscribed within the economy of sacrifice and death, where the infinite debt of sins get paid off by Christ's sacrificial death? This perversity of Christianity would then mean, as Zizek says, that God's free gift is aimed at putting you in a position of permanent debt. While that may seem to be its most likely meaning, the perverse core really lies in exactly the opposite direction. Now that sounds like Zizek. That the death of Jesus on the cross is the death of God, the last gasp of that transcendent and separate being whom we can count on to keep general watch over the mundane affairs here below and to bail us out when the going gets rough. Christianity thus turns out to be like psychoanalysis. From Zizek. Contrary to all appearances, this is what happens in psychoanalysis. The treatment is over when the patient accepts the non-existence of the big other. The ideal addressee of our speech, the ideal listener, is the psychoanalyst, the very opposite of the master figure that guarantees meaning. The patient accepts the absence of such a guarantee. And further, contrary to all appearances, that is also the very core of Christianity, a Christianity for which, my God, why have you forsaken me, from Matthew chapter 27, verse 46, has become the watchword. From Zizek. The Holy Spirit is a community deprived of its support in the big other. The point of Christianity as the religion of atheism is not the vulgar humanist one that the becoming man of God reveals that man is the secret of God. Rather, it attacks the religious hard core that survives even in humanism, even up to Stalinism, with its belief in history as the big other that decides on the objective meaning of our deeds. That is the ultimate heroic gesture that awaits Christianity. In order to save its treasure, it has to sacrifice itself, like Christ, who had to die so that Christianity could emerge. If Christianity is the beginning of the end of the big other, and if this was recognized first by Hegel and the young Hegelians' critique of religion, psychoanalysis in its consummatum est, I cannot resist pointing out that in erring in atheology, Mark C. Taylor made pretty much the same argument on behalf of deconstruction when he said that deconstruction is the hermeneutic of the death of God. For by deconstructing the transcendental signified, it had deconstructed not only the old God, but any big contenders for the place vacated by the old God, subject or object, history or the book, structuralism or humanism, science or psychoanalysis. The name of God here is the name of anything that pretends to provide abiding and centered presence, which is the theological gesture par excellence. In deconstruction, or in psychoanalysis a la Zizek, man is not the secret of God. The secret is, to paraphrase Derrida, there is no secret, no big other who has the secret. Deconstruction is the deconstruction of the theological place, the very place of the big other, of the very taking place of theology. On this point, whatever his rhetorical sallies, Zizek is serving up vintage deconstruction. The perverse core of Christianity is thus to be the perversion of a perversion. But we should resist concluding that this sets things straight, since the ortho in orthodoxy is tied up with the two worlds theory. It is better to say that this sends this perversity off in a more productive and inventive direction, like a productive misreading, a fertile and seminal heresy. The death of God is the death of the big other, where perversion means that the native forces and energies of a thing are turned against itself, are alienated and become destructive, so that what is meant to liberate binds us up, that is meant to empower innervates us. But to pervert a perversity is not a matter of simple negation, where the negation of a negation returns us to an affirmation. For dialectics, too, is a distortion of the event, an attempt to repress and rule the event. Perversity requires that we re-inhabit and redescribe and redirect the perversity to reform it from within in order to release its elemental forces, its anarchic energies, its chaosmic tendencies. The perversion of a perversion requires working through it, reinterpreting it, repeating it, so that what all has been recorded in the register of death and repression may now be replayed, repossessed, reenacted in the register of life, of free play, of the gift, of the grace of the event. I endorse Zizek's insistence that with Christianity nothing is finished, that nothing more than a transition will have been marked, because the future stretches before us as a task to be achieved in which we bear the responsibility to fill up what is lacking in the body of God. That is the basis of a productive theopolitics, in my view. This means that the Messianic postures of Judaism and Christianity are different but overlapping. In Judaism, we are called upon to expect and make ready for the Messianic age. In Christianity, the Messiah has already come. But that means that we ourselves are called to carry out the Messianic event, to bring it to completion, to occupy the Messianic position, and to make ready a second coming, where everything turns on what is coming. That represents a very powerful perversion of the Messianic event, which might be compared to the one that has been marked off by Benjamin's reversal of the Messianic age, where we are the ones in the Messianic position, the ones the dead have been waiting for to remedy the evil that has been done to them. So I'm just going to sideline this and say Benjamin's angel of history here. The perversity introduced by Christianity is, as Zizek says, that God has entered into his own creation so as to expose himself to all its contingencies and vagaries. But if that is so, then in what sense is the absolute still an absolute? In what sense is God still God? In one sense, in more than one sense, it is not, which is why Spinoza was attacked as an atheist. That is the radical in radical theology, the perversity of it all, and what I am calling here the perversity of the absolute. The absolute is not the absolutely transcendent and sovereign being of classical theology, nor is it the deeper law of nature, a la Spinoza, nor the ground of being in Tillich's theology of culture, which steers all things wisely and mightily, albeit imminently and immediately, into a good dialectical outcome. So Tillich's correlation theology here. The absolute is neither absolute transcendence nor absolute transcendence in immanence, neither a supreme being nor being in and for itself, nor being as the ground of beings, nor is it beyond or without being in the sense of mystical theology, for the hyper in hyperousios is another more resourceful attempt to preserve the transcendence of the absolute, although its felicitous tropes and gestures elicit widespread admiration and awaken another possibility that I am not exploring here. The difference with all these versions of the metaphysics of the absolute is that they take the absolute to be a strong force, not a weak one. That perversion of strength into weakness, the perversity of the weakness of God, which is greater than the strength of the world, is a crucial motif for me. The motif of the cross itself, the very perversity of the cross. So Caputo has written extensively on the weakness of God. On my accounting, and I would like to see this as a long-range effect or byproduct of Hegel, the great perversity of classical theology is to treat God as an effective force, either an actual and entitative power, as in the Deus omnipotens of classical creation theology, or as an ontologically effective force, as in Spinoza's Natura Naturans, and in Hegel and Tillich, which exercises its power immediately in the world. In classical theism, God is the supremely powerful and transcendent creator of heaven and earth, where the main thing that baffles us about a being so powerful, wise, and beneficent is how the world God made could have turned out so badly for so many. Hegel took the revolutionary step of divesting this supreme entity of its separate transcendence and harnessed all this power to driving the forces of history and culture. God is not a supreme and separate actuality, not actually absolute, but an absolute becoming or becoming absolute, a process unfolding, not only in history, a figure that still preserves the transcendence implied by the figure of incarnation, but more important, as history, in and as history itself. This is crucial. God is the becoming absolute of the absolute, the actualization of the absolute through the laws of its dialectical unfolding. But the proximity of Hegel to classical theism shows up in the way that Hegel is exposed to exactly the same objection as classical theism. For how could history, as the beginning absolute of the absolute, have run such a bloody course? What sort of perversity is it? What sort of blasphemy or obscenity against life is it to say that the absolute mourns its progress on the bodies of the dead? That many innocent flowers trampled along the way of the absolute's itinerary. As Lyotard has shown, there is no excuse today for even asking what divine wisdom was served by such merciless slaughters. It was to Tillich's credit that he saw this as a problem, and for that reason had recourse to Schelling's Ungrund, which at least allows him to inscribe a certain undecidability in the absolute, in virtue of which it can occasionally go over to the dark side, not to another place, but to its own dark side, the underside of its own nature. In any version of this metaphysics of the absolute, the assumption is that God is an effective force which influences the flow of things on earth, either a direct supernatural or magical force, as in classical theism, or an indirect and mediated one immersed in nature and history, over whose actualization God exercises effective force, as in Hegel and Tillich. But suppose this assumption is questioned. Suppose this perverse power of metaphysical theology is perverted. Suppose there is a flow of time and expanse of space over which God exerts no effective force or power, whether as a supreme being or being itself. Suppose God is not an actual power, but a weak force. Suppose the only power of God is the power of powerlessness, because God, or the event that transpires in this name, belongs to another order other than the order of actual or effective power. Suppose God does not belong to the order of effective power at all, neither transcendent nor immanent, but to another order, that of the event, as a kind of teeming of the event or boiling of the virtual. Suppose, perversely, that God is a certain play of virtualities, whose actual effects, outcomes, instantiations, or actualizations form a complex of time, chance, and circumstance, for better and for worse, issuing in irregular and unpredictable combinations of human malice and benignity, natural abundance and scarcity, in times and places good and bad, in ecstasies both joyous and horrifying, in circumstances that constrict and strangle no less than in ones that liberate and open up. Suppose that God makes both his rain and his sun to shine on the righteous and the unrighteous. Suppose that God is a kind of infinite reservoir of virtualities seeking actualization. Yes. Okay, Deleuze and theology. I am in part drawing upon the framework proposed by Deleuze's philosophy of the event to imagine God, but not uncritically. The limitation of Deleuze is the limits of his imaginations when it comes to God, whose escape from classical theology he rarely plots. For the most part, the name of God for Deleuze represents the rule of identity over difference, of hierarchy over freedom, of necessity over chance, of what he calls the analogy of being, where all things are proportioned and distributed according to the standard and measure set by God. So when Deleuze marks off a fixed distribution, where each thing has a predicted place to which it is assigned once and for all, where individuals are monitored so that being is distributed across them according to the rule of categories and sedentary proportionality, he decides to call that an orderly and a divine distribution. This is distinguished from nomadic distribution, which happens across borders in open space, in an errant or delirious distribution, which he calls demonic because it operates in the intervals between the fields marked off by the gods, upsetting their sedentary structures, producing a crowned anarchy. While I support and understand the strategic value of these designations vis-a-vis the old ontotheologic, it is long overdue to ask whether there is not another view of the divine. Is not Deleuze criticizing a very literal reproduction of the old theology rather than its genuine theological repetition? For example, is this not a very short-sighted view of the distribution of bodies in the New Testament, which is marked precisely by upsetting such sedentary structures, overthrowing its temple tables, violating its rules of ritual purity and separation, trafficking among the lame and lepers, the prostitutes and the poor, and by feasts where the outsiders are in and the insiders are out? Is this not a very short-sighted view to take of the prophets of the Jewish scriptures dressed in sackcloth, railing against the powers that be, who end up losing their life for their troubles? Is there no way to think the name of God as associated precisely with the unequal, different, impure, the disturbing, and anarchical? Might not the royalty of God be a crowned anarchy? Might there not be a divine disturbance, a precious perversity? Let us see a sacred anarchy that is counterpart to this crowned anarchy. What is more perverse than the reversals and paradoxes that the figure of Jesus puts into effect in the order of temple authority? The same point may be made in reference to the early use of the word theology in Derrida, for whom the book exercises the encyclopedic protection of theology and logocentrism against the disruption of writing, against its aphoristic energy, and, as I shall specify later, against difference in general. But what if everything about the name of God were to suggest that this name belongs precisely on the side of aphoristic energies and difference, of what disrupts encyclopedic projects? Then theology would go on, this time reinscribed within difference. To be sure, there are times when Deleuze himself recognizes this, as does Derrida later on. Moments when he says that what is actual is like the solution to a problem, whereas problems are of the order of the event, which function like the dreams of the gods, singular points of virtuality distributed throughout real things. Events are the dreams of the gods that the world wants to make come true. The world is a game of divine dice, of the chance of grace, of the grace of a chance. That is to associate God not with the actual but the virtual, not with order but with chance, not with what is finished or finalized, but what is still to come, not with what is, but with what is coming or becoming, which is why Deleuze thinks that even the dissolved or fragmented self still sings the glory of God. Wow. At these moments, it has to be said, Deleuze is thinking with Nietzsche of the Greek gods, the pagan gods, of what we can call the sacred, but without Levinus's sneer. We in turn are duty-bound to recover what Levinus obscures, that the Jewish and Christian scriptures are packed with praise for the glory of the world that God has created. The imagery of Jesus in speaking of the kingdom of God is drawn almost completely from the natural world, even as they do indeed highlight what Levinus, breathing easier now, calls the holy, the face of the neighbor and the stranger. But there is no need to choose among the multiple play of divine effects, to choose between the sacred and holy, for both the lilies of the field and the widow and the orphan bear the glory of the Lord. Both instantiate, actualize, embody the events that stir in the name of God. Deleuze's logic of sense is thus implicitly a theologic of the event without being an ontotheology. It is a logic of divine events, of the sense of God, but not of some supreme and powerful entity or underlying being. The world is a set of provisional solutions to the question put to it by the name of God, by the singularities that circulate, combine, and recombine in unforeseeable ways in the name of God. Such divine events are the salt that gives taste to the food of the world, the yeast that leavens the bread of the world, the absolute that is astir in the multiple forms of spirit. That is why there ought to be no war, no contest between the sacred and the secular, between the events that stir within the name of God and the multiform and plurivocal world that rises up in response to a divine provocation. That is why, as I will point out below, it is not a question of keeping theology out of politics, but of rethinking the radical theology that drives a more radical politics. In this theology, more radically conceived, the name of God harbors an infinite reservoir of virtualities, like a great divine gathering place or chora. It proceeds on the assumption that the name of God is a signal of a vast depository of every actuality gone by, of the potentiality to which they return, of an infinite sea or endless ensemble of potentialities from which things arise and in return to which all things actual come and go in a great cosmic inhalation and exhalation, like the rising and sinking of a huge divine breast. Oh my gosh, this is amazing. The name of God is a marker of the uncontainable, irrepressible excess things contain or cannot quite contain, like a buoy on the surface of the water alerting us to a dangerous swirl below. Oh my gosh, brilliant. The perversity of Hegel's rereading of Christian theology as the death of God and as the death of this death, and hence his radical perversion of the figure of incarnation, which sent Kierkegaard into spasms, opens the door to radical theology today. The grievances Kierkegaard brought against Hegel opens the divide between the neo-orthodoxy of Barth and the correlational theology of Tillich, who is the grandfather of radical theology. Hegel launched the task of thinking God without God. He perverted the vertical and separate transcendence of a being presiding over this world from his station in another, higher, one behind the scenes. Hegel launched the project of the radicalization of the incarnation and of the theme of God with us, proposing to take it all the way to the end, which means to bring it back into this world. He proposed thinking God reconciled with the worlding of the world, and the pain of death that is woven into the world, reconciling God with time and history and culture. When he said that the absolute is both subject and substance, he was acknowledging his antecedents in this risky business. Spinoza, on the one hand, whose famous Deus Sive Natura had boldly charted a part of the path Hegel was following, and Fichte, on the other hand. He was saying that the world is the body of the absolute, its embodiment and palpability, even as the absolute is the inner subjective and spiritual life of the world. Hegel's limitation was to do all this while remaining in the thralls of metaphysics, the metaphysics of substance and subject, as well as the metaphysics of history, over which the absolute presided as its immanent teleological force. The perverse core of Hegel lay in being a liminal figure, this lining surface that on one side is the absolute consummation of metaphysics, where metaphysics tries to contain the uncontainable force of the event, while on the other side simultaneously showing the way out of such perversity. It is clear that the perversion launched by Hegel is incomplete and that it needs to be pushed beyond itself, that the perversity of Hegel has not yet been fully tapped. We are in search of another Hegel, a perverse core in Hegel, beyond the Hegel who thinks the absolute makes its cunning way by subtly steering the passions of human beings who are but bearers of its absolute force. Zizek has recently offered another way to look at Hegel, elaborating the proposals made in The Puppet and the Dwarf, which deserve our attention. Zizek wants us to treat the orthodox Hegel as a cliché about Hegel and proposes a more productive perversion of Hegel's spirit. Zizek follows a standard reading of Hegel that the incarnation is the death of God as Father, as a separate and transcendent being, and that the crucifixion is the death of the Son, the breakup of the empirical being of Jesus in order to make way for the coming of the Spirit. But the new twist he introduces is to revise our understanding of the Spirit. The last words on the cross, my God, why have you abandoned me?" represent the expiration not only of the orthodox version of Spirit in Nicene Christianity, but of the standard reading of Hegel, where the Spirit is the transcendence and immanence of the absolute that makes use of individuals in their passions. So from Zizek, the point this reading misses is the ultimate lesson to be learned from the divine incarnation. The finite existence of mortal humans is the only site of the Spirit, the site where Spirit achieves its actuality. Spirit is a virtual entity in the sense that its status is that of a subjective presupposition. It exists only insofar as subjects act as if it exists. Its status is similar to that of an ideological cause like communism or nation. It is the substance of the individuals who recognize themselves in it, the ground of their entire existence, the point of reference which provides the ultimate horizon of meaning to their lives, something for which these individuals are ready to give their lives. Yet the only thing that really exists are these individuals and their activity. So the substance is actual only insofar as individuals believe in it and act accordingly. The crucial mistake to be avoided is therefore to grasp the Hegelian spirit as a kind of meta-subject, a mind, much larger than an individual human mind, aware of itself. Once we do this, Hegel has to appear as a ridiculous spiritualist obscurantist, claiming that there is a kind of mega-spirit controlling our history. This holds especially for the Holy Spirit. Our awareness, the self-consciousness of finite humans, is its only actual sight. Although God is the substance of our human entire being, he is omnipotent without us. He acts only in and through us. He is posited through our activity as its presupposition. Okay, I'm going to stop there for now, and I will make a part 2 video soon. So again, I was reading John Caputo's essay from Hegel and the Infinite, edited by Zizek. So I hope you enjoyed that. I love this essay, and I am looking forward to finishing it up. So just be on the lookout for part 2. Thanks.